I honestly hate to say it, these long pole switches are probably going to be our future. Let's get into why. This video is going to focus on the long pole switches from Invokeys, the black sesame. The video is sponsored, but my opinion is always my own. So when you build a keyboard, typically the last thing to get a 7 out of 10 keyboard to be an 8 or 9 is the sound. This will be the nagging case resonance for those who are coping, but in reality it's hollowness. Typically regular switches are pretty straightforward. Take this here, MX Black. So when you push down on a keycap, it presses into the stem. The stem will travel along the housing rails and then bottom out at the bottom. So to make sure this is smooth and sounds good, you end up lubing the stem, end up lubing the housing, the spring as well, and there's just a lot of surfaces that you need to take into account. And lubing switches takes time. It can be anywhere from 2 hours to 3 hours. And because with the regular switch, the rails bottom out on both sides, if you put too much lube or you put too little lube, it really makes a huge difference. There's just a lot of surfaces. If the lube pulls down at the bottom of the rails, it can get goopy and wet. And this is one of the situations in life where you don't want it wet. With a long pole stem, the center of the pole is actually longer and it bottoms out there instead. So when you press the switch, that center pole is what bottoms out instead of the sliders. So one singular interaction point versus 2. This yields a different sound. The long PP impact into the housing drives so much of the sound that you can immediately tell what's a long pole switch and what is not. And the drawback is typically the travel of the switch. When you get a long pole switch with reduced travel, when you press it down, you can still see a bit of the stem peeking out. And that's because it's reduced travel. These black sesame switches are 3.3 millimeters reduced travel. The shorter travel can sometimes feel abrupt in feeling depending on the mounting style and the plate and PCB. It's all due to preference though. Like right now, long pole switches are extremely popular. One of the most popular ones are the Zaku switches, which are 3.5 millimeters. The OG long pole switch is a black cherry pie. And you have a cherry top, H1 bottom, and some form of kale long pole stem. Pretty obvious that the stem is sticking out. Different sound, deeper sound, louder sound. People typically prefer that. These black sesame switches is gonna have a very short travel of 3.3 millimeters. Some of the features that make this switch special is the dust-proof stem. I'm not a huge believer of the dust-proof stem or that feature of it, but this box-style stem typically is pretty smooth out of the factory. So if you have factory lubing on these box-style stems, it actually works a treat. There's reduced stem wobble, but that's not personally something that bothers me. I never really wiggle my keycaps and I never notice it. So maybe ignorance is bliss here and I can use more switches because the stem wobble isn't a problem for me. But the feature can't hurt. It helps keep the type feel consistent. But I will say the box stems kind of look a little ugly. Hey, just preference, right? In here, there is a lighter 55-gram spring. I think this works out better because it trains my fingers to type more softly. I personally do not favor long pole switches because they're reduced travel and the way that I hammer onto my keys ends up being rough on the hands, especially since I prefer top mount with a stiff plate like aluminum. It's gonna feel pretty harsh. This is a 55-gram spring and it's also a long spring, 20 millimeters long. The actuation force is a little bit higher, which means that it kind of balances out the light spring. This is different from the matcha latte, which is 63.5 gram, but it was a 15 millimeter spring. Those springs actuate pretty quickly because it's shorter distance. Force curves are different. Those actually felt very close to how these feel, but it's just a different feeling in hand, and it's really hard to describe it to you. You kind of have to try the switches on a keyboard with your own hands to figure it out. The main draw with these black sesame switches is that they're Aphelion. So Aphelion came onto the market with the matcha lattes, like I mentioned, and the consistency in the factory lubing was amazing. And I mentioned earlier, lubing takes time, right? Well, with long pole switches, it's really hard to mess up the lubing when the bottom mount is on the center pole. So if you want a factory lube switch, long pole is honestly the way to go, because even if they kind of mess up per se, a little bit less consistent or a little bit heavy on the lubing, because it's bottom out the pole, that doesn't affect the sound and feel of the switch as much. Out of the 110 factory lube switches here, I cracked open 6 and they were very consistently lubed. I'm not really worried about consistency here at all, but I will say when I first looked at them, opened them up, the lube was a little bit heavier than the light lubing that I typically do myself. And when I pressed it in hand, it actually sounded a little bit quiet. So a little bit concerning there because the board that we're going to put this in is the Cycle 7. And the Cycle 7, generally because of the flex cuts on the PCB and the flex cuts on the plate, is a little bit on the quieter side. So if you put a quiet switch in a quiet board, it may not end up sounding good. And in terms of lube on the bottom housing, I didn't really see anything other than any lube that kind of was applied to the stem and then got distributed to the housing as you type on it. There was lube on the spring itself, which is really good because you won't get spring ping. Stocky switch for sure. So with the Cycle 7, right here, we have an aluminum plate in here, and we're gonna put in the black sesame switches. The original build was MX black on aluminum, and it sounded great, very clacky, but definitely lacking in creativity. And when I put in the board, the black sesame switches actually sounded pretty great. So you hear that spacebar, right? Long pole spacebars sound very good, and that's why a lot of people use black cherry pies specifically in the spacebar, and you get a nice spacebar sound. Nice, loud, full, poppy, talky, just all the words for the spacebar. So I'm pleasantly surprised that the Cycle 7, despite being a quieter board, and the black sesame switches, despite sounding pretty quiet in hand, sounded amazing together. Like, I was honestly expecting to put together, kind of review it, and then take it out. But I'm willing to keep it in here because the feel was actually really perfect. Because there's a gasket mount and flex cuts everywhere, the typing experience is pretty soft and flexible. And it goes back to that 3.3mm travel with the black sesame switches. It actually worked in the favor of the board. Like, it worked well together. At Patreon, he used the Gateron cream soda switches, which were 3.7mm travel, long pole, but used it in a top mount aluminum plate and had no flexibility, pretty stiff. It felt like typing into a brick. So if you're gonna use long pole switches, I do suggest that you use a plate that is flexible or mounting that's flexible. So top mount, maybe don't use a full board of long pole switches. Cycle 7 is very flexible. It's really nice to type on, which is one of the reasons why I like it. And these switches, 3.3mm, which typically I do not like. Man, I really don't like it. Feels like I'm typing into a brick wall. Like I mentioned, the spring, it's 20mm length, so at the top of the force curve, when you press down, it's a little bit harder to press, and I find that that slows down my typing a little bit, so I can't just punch into the back of the board. I'm actually going a little bit slower, and because I'm training myself with the lighter spring, I'm not bottoming out as hard, and it feels pretty okay to type on. Like, sure, I've only typed on it for a few hours right now as I write this review, but I think I can definitely use this, like maybe turning over a new leaf with long pole switches. So here, it's actually a pretty nice combination. So I have the light, long spring that's actually really comfortable to type on, despite personally preferring 63.5 gram to 65 gram springs. I have the flexible plate and PCB, making it softer and gasket mount, of course. Overall, it's pretty balanced to type on. Like, I don't think a short travel long pole switch is good for every single board, but it works here. So overall, the black sesame switch is a great pairing with budget boards coming in. It's a little bit more expensive at 65 cents per switch, but it is factory lubed and you don't have to open it up. Especially when people are coming into the hobby, having to buy a switch opener, a stem holder, grease, films, and figuring it all out and following guides. Sure, there's guides, but it takes a lot of time. Maybe you just want to buy a board, put switches in, put keycaps in, and be ready to go. So I think that this is a compelling option for a lot of these budget boards, because it's really easy to put together. Like this board right here, dude, just I can pop it off like that. Like, if it's that easy, why not also have a factory loop switch to throw in there so I don't have to fiddle around the board too much. So at 65 cents, it's a little bit more expensive, but not as expensive as other options like Gateron cream sodas. Pretty expensive. This build is a very comfy typing experience, and the switch overall I think is a little bit comfier than matcha lattes because of the spring choice. It's not too shabby. This honestly might dethrone matcha lattes for me. I've been honestly meaning to take my MX Blacks out of my Cycle 7 anyway, so these black sesame switches might actually stay in here. I'm glad that the Athlon switches with input keys have not just been a fluke with the matcha latte, because that was really good, reliable lubing and consistency in QC. I'm glad it's maintained in the V2 run of the matcha lattes, as well as these black sesame switches. And just, you know, these are the V2, so don't get confused with the V1. Thanks for watching. I think these switches are a home run, a nice combination, because honestly, I've never really ventured out to try different springs. 55 gram 20mm spring, not too shabby. Let me know in the comment section what you think of these black sesame switches. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.